I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft footsteps near my bed. My heart raced as I turned to see him standing there, my stepson, his eyes lingering far too long. "Are you okay?" he asked, but the way he looked at me said something else entirely. I should have sent him away. Instead, I let the moment linger, knowing I was crossing a dangerous line. I never thought my life would turn out this way. At 35, I believed I had finally found stability when I married Mark, a charming, successful man who swept me off my feet. He came with a teenage son, Ethan, who was polite, reserved, and surprisingly accepting of me as his stepmother. It felt like a dream. We were the perfect blended family, or so I thought. The first year was blissful. Mark showered me with affection, and Ethan seemed happy to have me around. I took pride in creating a warm home for them, filling the empty spaces with love and laughter. But dreams don't always last. Mark's business took off, pulling him away from home more often than not. At first, I welcomed the quiet evenings and alone time. I told myself it was temporary. But weeks turned into months, and loneliness became my new routine. I started noticing Ethan more, not as a child but as a man. He had grown into his features over the years, his once awkward frame now strong and confident. He reminded me of Mark in some ways, the same sharp jawline, piercing eyes, but softer, more vulnerable. I hated myself for even thinking it, but the thoughts wouldn't stop. Ethan was kind, always offering to help around the house, fixing things Mark left undone. He made me laugh when I felt like crying and noticed when I'd had a bad day. When I broke a glass in the kitchen one night, overwhelmed by frustration, he appeared out of nowhere, gently taking my hand and helping me clean up the mess. His touch lingered just a second too long, and I felt something shift, something dangerous. I tried to convince myself it was harmless. I was just lonely, starved for attention. But that didn't explain the way my heart raced whenever he looked at me, or the way his eyes seemed to hold secrets I wasn't ready to face. I told myself I was imagining it, that nothing had changed. But deep down I knew I was lying. And lying, I would soon discover, was only the beginning. It started with small things, glances that lingered too long, accidental touches that sent shivers down my spine. I told myself I was imagining it, but the tension between us grew heavier with each passing day. Mark's calls became shorter, his texts more infrequent. He was busy, always busy, building his business empire while I sat at home, feeling like an afterthought. I told myself it wasn't his fault. He was providing for us. But that didn't make the empty bed beside me any easier to bear. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. "You okay?" he asked one evening as I stared blankly at the TV, the remote limp in my hand. "Fine," I lied, forcing a smile. But he didn't believe me. Over time, Ethan stepped into the spaces Mark had left empty. He started helping me cook dinner, sitting with me during lonely evenings, and making excuses to spend time at home instead of going out with friends. It felt innocent at first, comforting even, but then the look started. I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his eyes dark, intense, and filled with something I didn't dare name. My heart raced whenever he walked into the room, and I hated myself for how I felt. One night, it all became too much. I'd poured myself a glass of wine, hoping to dull the ache of loneliness. But the more I drank, the harder it was to keep my thoughts in check. I sat on the couch, my silk robe falling loosely around my legs, and let my mind wander to places it shouldn't. That's when Ethan walked in. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I looked up, startled, and quickly pulled my robe tighter. "Just thinking," I murmured, avoiding his gaze. He sat down beside me, too close, his knee brushing mine. "You don't have to be alone, you know," he said, his voice low. I froze. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, his hand lingered on my knee, his thumb brushing gently against my skin. My breath hitched, and I knew I should pull away, but I didn't. For the next few days, I couldn't look him in the eye. But the damage had already been done. The line we weren't supposed to cross had been blurred, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it disappeared completely. Ethan began testing boundaries after that night. He'd brush against me in the kitchen, his hand resting on my lower back a moment too long. He'd stand too close when we talked, his eyes lingering on my lips. I told myself I had to stop this before it went too far. But the truth was, part of me didn't want to stop. Then came the night that changed everything. I was in my room, the door slightly ajar, when I heard footsteps. Before I could react, Ethan was standing in the doorway. "Tina," he said, his voice rough and strained. I clutched the sheets, my heart pounding. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he admitted, stepping closer. "You need to leave," I whispered, But even as I said the words, I didn't move. He stepped closer still, his eyes locked on mine. And that's when I knew we had already gone too far. The days that followed felt like a fever dream, hot, restless, and impossible to escape. I told myself that night in the doorway was just a mistake, a moment of weakness we both regretted. But the way Ethan looked at me said otherwise. And the way I felt when he was near made it clear. I wasn't ready to let this end. I avoided him at first, throwing myself into chores, errands, anything to keep busy. But he didn't make it easy. One afternoon, I was folding laundry when he appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "No, I'm fine," I replied, but my hands trembled as I folded one of his shirts, the fabric still warm from the dryer. He stepped closer. "You sure?" I looked up, and our eyes locked. There was no mistaking the heat between us. It crackled like static electricity, making it impossible to breathe. I should have left the room. I should have told him to stop. But instead, I stood there, frozen, as he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "You're beautiful," he said softly, and my resolve shattered. From that moment, everything changed. The tension that had simmered between us for weeks boiled over. Suddenly, every touch felt deliberate, every glance heavy with meaning. He brushed against me when we passed in the hallway. His hand lingered on mine when he handed me a plate at dinner. And then came the night I couldn't resist anymore. It was late, and I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when Ethan walked in wearing nothing but sweatpants and a t-shirt that clung to his body in all the right ways. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside me. I shook my head. "No." He reached out and brushed my knee, the same way he had before. But this time I didn't stop him. "I think about you all the time," he admitted, his voice raw and vulnerable. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan, we can't." "Then tell me you don't feel it too," he interrupted, leaning closer. I opened my mouth to say the words, but nothing came out. Instead, he reached up and cupped my face, his thumb brushing over my lips. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered. "And I don't think you want me to." And just like that, the dam broke. I didn't stop him when he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft at first, but quickly grew desperate and hungry. I didn't stop him when his hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should push him away. But in that moment, I didn't care. We pulled apart just long enough to catch our breath, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked. I wasn't sure, but I nodded anyway. What happened next felt inevitable, like we'd been moving toward this moment since the first time our eyes met. His hands explored my body, and mine did the same. Every touch, every kiss, felt like crossing another line we could never uncross. And when it was over, we lay there in silence, both of us knowing we'd changed everything. But the worst part wasn't what we'd done. It was how much I wanted to do it again. The next morning, we avoided each other. He left early for the gym, and I stayed in my room until I was sure he was gone. But when he came home later that night, it was like we'd never left that moment on the couch. We couldn't stay away from each other. We told ourselves it was just one time, but it wasn't. One time turned into stolen moments in the kitchen, lingering touches in the hallway, and late-night whispers we both pretended didn't mean anything. And the guilt? It was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. But it wasn't enough to make me stop. Not when his eyes told me he wanted me just as badly as I wanted him. Not when his touch made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not when I knew that, no matter how wrong it was, I couldn't give him up. It was bound to unravel, it always is. Secrets like ours can't stay hidden forever. And yet, I told myself we were careful, that no one would ever know. But guilt has a way of creeping in, poisoning even the sweetest moments. The morning it all fell apart started like any other. Mark's weekly call had become more routine than meaningful. A check-in to remind me he was still out there, somewhere. I'd barely hung up the phone when Ethan walked into the kitchen, his eyes dark and heavy. "We need to talk," he said. I froze. "Ethan, not now." "No." He cut me off, stepping closer. "We can't keep pretending this is normal." "I can't keep pretending." His words hit me like a slap. "You knew what this was," I snapped, more defensive than I intended. "And what is it, Tina?" he demanded. "Because it sure as hell doesn't feel like nothing to me." The air felt thick, suffocating. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the front door swung open. Mark was home. His sudden return caught us both off guard. I jumped back, creating space between us, but it was too late. The tension in the room was palpable, and Mark's eyes darted between us, suspicion flickering across his face. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "We were just—" But Ethan couldn't hold it in any longer. "Ask her," he said, his voice raw. "Ask her what's really been going on while you've been gone." "Ethan, stop!" I hissed, panic rising in my chest. Mark's gaze narrowed. "What is he talking about?" "It's not what you think," I started, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. Ethan didn't stop. "You left her alone," he accused, turning to Mark. "For months. You left her to feel unloved, unwanted. And Ethan, don't," I begged, tears welling in my eyes. But the damage was already done. Mark's face shifted from confusion to realization, and then to rage. "You!" He took a step toward Ethan, his fists clenched. "With her? Stop!" I screamed, stepping between them. "It's not his fault. It's mine." Mark's eyes burned into me, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw something break inside him. "How long?" he demanded. I couldn't speak. My silence was answer enough. The room spun as Mark turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I wanted to run after him, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But instead, I sank to the floor, shaking as Ethan knelt beside me. "It's over," I whispered. "Everything's ruined." He reached for me, but this time I pulled away. "No," I said firmly. "This was wrong. All of it. And it has to stop." The finality in my voice seemed to hit him like a blow. "But I love you," he said, his voice breaking. I closed my eyes, willing myself not to cry. "You think you do. But this isn't love, Ethan. It's loneliness. It's desperation. And it's over." He didn't argue. He just stood there, staring at me for what felt like an eternity before walking out the door. Mark didn't come home that night, or the next. I spent hours replaying everything, wondering how we had ended up here. And for the first time, I faced the truth. I had let myself believe that Ethan filled the void Mark left behind. But the void wasn't Mark's fault. It was mine. I had built my happiness around someone else, instead of finding it within myself. When Mark finally returned, he didn't say much. He didn't need to. The silence between us said it all. "I can't do this anymore," he said quietly. Neither could I. We agreed to separate, and just like that, the life I had spent years building crumbled. As for Ethan, he moved out a few weeks later, cutting ties completely. I thought I'd feel relief, but all I felt was emptiness. I spent months trying to rebuild my confidence, my independence, my sense of self. And slowly I started to heal. But some wounds never fully close. Months later, I ran into Ethan at a coffee shop. He looked older, more serious, but the way he looked at me hadn't changed. "Hi," he said, his voice hesitant. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Hi." We stood there in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "So am I." And just like that, we said goodbye. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the people who make us feel alive are the ones who burn us the most. And sometimes the hardest thing isn't letting go. It's knowing you should have never held on in the first place. The house felt hollow after Ethan left. Every room carried echoes of what had happened. The stolen glances, whispered words, and forbidden touches. I tried to convince myself that ending it was the right choice, but the silence only reminded me of everything I'd lost. Mark and I barely spoke. When we did, it was tense and mechanical, discussions about logistics, bills, and the process of separating our lives. The warmth we once shared had been replaced by cold indifference. I moved into the guest room. It felt like punishment, and maybe that's what I deserved. Every night, I lay awake replaying the last few months, questioning how I let things spiral so far out of control. Ethan's absence hit harder than I expected. I'd see his empty chair at the kitchen table, the gym bag he used to leave by the door, or the hoodie he forgot in the laundry room. And every time it felt like a fresh wound. Mark, on the other hand, buried himself in work. I knew he was avoiding me, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and no apology could fix that. The guilt was suffocating. I tried to stay busy, cleaning, rearranging furniture, and working late nights on freelance projects. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the weight of what I'd done. Ethan reached out once. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when his name lit up the screen. "Ethan, are you okay?" I stared at the message for what felt like hours, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. But what could I say? That I missed him? That I hated myself for everything we'd done? That I still thought about him every single night? I typed and deleted a dozen replies before finally settling on, "Me, I'm fine. Please don't text me again." I hit send and immediately regretted it. But I knew it was the right thing to do. We had to move on, even if it hurt. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between Mark and me grew wider. Eventually we stopped pretending. "It's time," he said one night over dinner, his voice steady but resigned. I nodded. "I know." We finalized the divorce a month later. It was quiet and civil, but the finality of it still felt like a knife to the heart. As for Ethan, he vanished from my life entirely. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he transferred schools and moved out of state. Part of me was relieved. Distance was what we both needed. But another part of me ached to know how he was doing, if he had moved on, or if he still thought about me. Time dulled the pain, but it never fully went away. One afternoon, months later, I ran into him. I was at the grocery store, lost in thought as I reached for a bag of apples, when I heard his voice behind me. "Tina." I turned, and there he was. Older, more mature, but still the Ethan I remembered. "Hi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for a moment, awkward and unsure. "You look good," he said finally, his eyes searching mine. "So do you." There was so much I wanted to say, but none of the words came. Instead, we stood in silence until he finally broke it. "I'm seeing someone," he said softly. My heart twisted, but I forced a smile. "That's great. I'm happy for you." "Are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. I hesitated, then nodded. "I am." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I should go. It was good seeing you." "You too," I replied, even though it wasn't true. As I watched him walk away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that he was moving on. Sadness that a part of me never would. In the end, the consequences of our choices rippled far beyond what either of us could have imagined. Mark and I were over. Ethan and I were nothing more than a painful memory. And I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I had shattered. I learned the hard way that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And no matter how much you wish you could go back, some mistakes stay with you forever. Months turned into years, but the scars of what happened never fully faded. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, though it often felt like trying to walk through quicksand. Mark moved on quickly, remarrying within a year. I told myself it didn't hurt, but deep down, it stung to see how easily he had left me behind. I stayed single, choosing solitude over the risk of falling into another mistake. I poured myself into work, focusing on my photography, and slowly building a reputation in the art world. On the surface, I seemed fine, successful, independent, and unbothered. But late at night, when the world was quiet, the memories would creep back in. I wondered if Ethan ever thought about me, if he ever regretted what we did, or if he'd managed to bury it completely. Then one afternoon I got my answer. I was preparing for an art exhibition when an email popped into my inbox. It was from Ethan. "I saw your work in a gallery last week. You're amazing. I hope you're doing well." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I could have ignored it, let it stay buried like everything else. But instead I replied, "Thank you. I'm glad you're happy. I hope you found everything you were looking for." His response was short but heartfelt. "I have. And I hope you have too." And just like that, the chapter finally closed. I realized then that what we shared wasn't love, not the kind that builds a life, anyway. It was loneliness and longing disguised as something deeper. And while it burned brightly for a moment, it was never meant to last. The guilt lingered, but so did the lesson. I learned that real love isn't about passion or excitement. It's about trust, respect, and knowing when to walk away, even when it hurts. I often wondered what might have happened if we had made different choices. Would we have fallen apart in the end, unable to sustain something so fragile? Or would we have destroyed each other completely, consumed by the weight of what we'd done? But none of that mattered anymore. The past was the past, and I had finally made peace with it. Mark and I never rekindled what we lost, but we managed to find civility. At family gatherings, we exchanged polite smiles and small talk, pretending we were never anything more than distant acquaintances. And Ethan? He got married last year. I saw the photos online, a beautiful bride, a picturesque wedding. He looked happy, truly happy. And for the first time, I felt happy for him too. As for me, I learned to be happy on my own. I traveled, made new friends, and even started dating again, slowly, cautiously, but with a clearer sense of what I wanted and what I deserved. Looking back, I don't regret what happened. Not entirely. It taught me who I was, who I didn't want to be, and forced me to face the parts of myself I'd tried so hard to hide. Sometimes the hardest lessons come from the biggest mistakes. And sometimes the most painful endings are the ones we need to find ourselves again. I'll never forget Ethan or the choices we made. But I've learned to let go of the guilt, to forgive myself, and to move forward. Because in the end, life isn't about the moments that break us. It's about how we pick up the pieces and build something stronger. What would you have done in her position? Could you walk away from temptation, or would you risk it all for a forbidden love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take on this emotional journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more heart-stopping stories like this one. Trust me, you won't believe what's coming next.